Everyone said little Emily would never speak. But after Luke, a quiet boy born on Christmas Eve, whispered one simple sentence to her, everything changed. For the first time in her life, she started talking, and you won't believe what her first word was. Her parents froze, and even the doctors couldn't explain it. But what Luke did only a few weeks later, with the neighbor who collapsed in the snow, was even more unbelievable. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more real miracle stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. All right, let's go back to the moment it happened. It was the winter of 2019, the kind of Illinois winter that coated everything in a thin crust of quiet. Cars moved slower, breath came out in ribbons, and even the air seemed older. Mark Reynolds pulled the keys from the front door of Reynolds Hardware and turned the sign to closed. He stood for a second beneath the buzzing fluorescent light, checking the lock twice out of habit. Inside, the aisle smelled of dust, motor oil, and pine cleaner. The store was his father's before him, a place where time moved in small repairs and steady bills, where a man could stay busy enough to forget how tired he was becoming. His back ached most days now, though he never said so. Lisa waited at home with the space heater running in the kitchen, and their son, Luke, reading by the window as usual. The boy rarely made noise. Sometimes Mark caught himself glancing toward the living room to be sure he was still there. Luke would look up from a book and smile faintly, and something about that small, steady smile could unsettle and comfort him in the same moment. But in less than 2 days, the smallest act of kindness between two children would make an entire town question what they believed about miracles. Snow had begun to fall again, the light, slow kind that seemed to hang in midair before touching ground. Mark loaded a small cooler into the SUV, the one they only used for long drives, and Lisa came out carrying a folded blanket and a grocery bag of snacks. Their weekend plan was simple: drive north to Rockford to see Tim and Rachel Collins, friends they hadn't seen in nearly 6 years. The families had met in college back when life felt open-ended and simple. Now, everything was measured in hours, invoices, and small acts of patience. Lisa still helped her mother 3 afternoons a week, still kept the same notepad by the phone filled with reminders. Refill blood pressure meds, pay ComEd, grocery list. She told Mark she needed a change of view. He agreed without much feeling because he knew what she meant. Luke sat in the back seat holding a box wrapped in blue paper, a puzzle set for the Collins daughter. "Don't forget to say thank you when we get there," Lisa said, adjusting her scarf. He nodded, eyes on the window, watching how the streetlights painted the snow orange. He was 8 now, old enough to ask about everything, yet rarely asked anything. Sometimes he would pause before speaking, as if translating his thoughts into a language they didn't know. The teachers wrote notes like, "Very observant, empathetic, quiet confidence." Lisa saved them all in a folder she couldn't explain why she kept. They reached Route 29, headlights carving tunnels through the falling snow. Mark turned on the radio, an old country station fading in and out, the signal soft and tired. He thought about the years gone by, how the town had shrunk, how his father's generation had known everyone by name. Lisa rested her head against the window, half asleep, her hand resting near Luke's small backpack. The boy kept staring forward, watching the rhythmic sweep of the wipers, his reflection blinking back at him. When they finally pulled into the Collins cul-de-sac, it was nearly 7. Warm yellow light spilled from the living room windows, and the smell of roast chicken reached them before they rang the bell. Rachel opened the door, face thinner than Lisa remembered, her hair tied back carelessly, the kind of tired beauty that came from years of holding everything together. Tim followed, smiling wide but with eyes that darted toward the hallway as if expecting trouble. They hugged, laughed about the cold, and helped bring in the bags. The house felt lived in, school drawings on the fridge, a laundry basket by the couch, a faint scent of baby lotion and disinfectant. Emily, their daughter, stood near the kitchen doorway clutching a stuffed lamb. She was 5 and small for her age, pale-haired, wearing a pink sweater with tiny silver stars. She watched Luke but didn't speak or wave. Rachel gave a short, practiced smile. "She understands everything," she said quietly. "She just doesn't talk." Dinner felt careful at first. The adults swapped stories about jobs, the rising cost of heating, their parents' health. Tim's voice carried fatigue when he spoke about the therapy trips to Chicago. Rachel listened to him with the polite stillness of someone who has explained the same thing too many times. Lisa nodded with sympathy. Mark poured coffee, and Luke sat beside Emily, stacking his peas into perfect circles. She leaned forward, copied his pattern, and a faint sound escaped her, something between a giggle and a breath. Rachel noticed instantly. "That's good, sweetheart," she said, her hand trembling slightly on the tablecloth. Emily didn't respond, but she kept watching Luke as if waiting for a signal only she could see. After dinner, Tim suggested the kids go outside to play. The air had calmed, the snow deeper now, the porch light casting a soft cone over the yard. Luke zipped his coat without help, pulled on gloves, and followed Emily out. The adults cleared plates and half listened to the muffled crunch of footsteps outside. Mark poured another cup of coffee. Rachel opened her phone to check tomorrow's forecast. Conversation drifted to mundane topics, the price of salt bags, the noise of new furnaces, until Rachel stopped mid-sentence. "Do you hear that?" she asked. The others froze. Through the window came a faint hum, thin and steady, like a child trying to remember a song. Rachel stepped to the glass, pressed her hand against the cold. The porch bulb flickered once. Outside, near the garden bed covered in snow, Luke knelt, speaking softly. Emily stood before him, motionless, breath forming small clouds. Rachel opened the door and the hum grew clearer, resolving into something that might have been a word. She ran into the yard without a coat, snow soaking her slippers. Emily looked up, eyes wide, and said one clear word. "Luke." The sound was fragile, almost disbelieving. Rachel gasped, dropped to her knees, pulled her daughter into her arms, sobbing. Tim came running out behind her, the others on his heels, their breath sharp in the freezing air. Emily said it again, louder this time, testing her own voice, then buried her face in Rachel's coat. Mark reached for his phone, uncertain if he should film or call someone. Lisa couldn't speak. Luke stood quietly beside them, cheeks red from the cold, staring at the snow. When Rachel tried to thank him, he looked up and said simply, "She was ready." His voice was soft, certain. No one moved for several seconds. The porch light flickered again, then steadied. Snow kept falling, thicker now, muffling every sound but their breathing. Rachel clutched Emily tighter, whispering her name over and over as if learning it for the first time. Tim looked at Mark helplessly, half laughing, half crying, his face flushed from cold and disbelief. But what they would learn the next morning would make that quiet moment feel even stranger. Inside, steam fogged the kitchen windows. Rachel tried to call the speech therapist's emergency line but couldn't form the words. Lisa helped Emily out of her wet clothes, wrapping her in a towel. The girl watched Luke from across the room, eyes fixed as though something invisible bound them in shared understanding. Mark poured whiskey into his coffee, saying nothing. Luke walked over to the window and placed his palm against the glass, watching snow pile up against the fence. "It's still quiet," he murmured. No one asked what he meant. The hour grew late. The adults sat clustered around the table while the children slept in the guest room. Rachel played the short video again, the sound faint but real. The word Luke came out of Emily's mouth like a small exhale of light. Lisa covered her mouth, trembling. Outside, the snow kept falling without wind, layering the street until every yard looked the same, erased and clean. A dog barked somewhere far off, then stopped. The clock ticked toward midnight, and the house settled into that deep, heavy silence particular to winter nights in the Midwest. Nobody noticed the brief flicker of light that passed across the backyard, faint and colorless, vanishing before they could name it. And while the adults sat together trying to explain what had just happened, Luke lay awake in the spare room, staring at the ceiling, listening to something only he seemed able to hear, a rhythm like breathing, steady and patient, moving through the stillness of the house. He whispered something, maybe a name, maybe a prayer, and the snow outside continued to fall as if it too were listening. The next morning came in pale layers of light, the kind that never quite turned gold but lingered between gray and silver, spreading through the thin curtains of the Collins kitchen. The smell of coffee drifted softly into the hallway, where Lisa stood barefoot, listening to the sound of a child's voice, repeating something over and over, quiet, deliberate, like someone learning how to breathe through words. At first, she thought it was the television, but when she walked closer, she saw Emily sitting at the table with a notebook open, pointing to a drawing of a bird and whispering the word bird again and again, her small hand shaking with concentration. Rachel stood nearby, phone pressed to her ear, voice trembling as she tried to reach the therapist's office. Her hair was still damp from the shower she had taken before dawn. She hadn't slept at all. But what happened before noon that day would make even the most rational among them hesitate before saying the word coincidence again. Tim entered from the living room, wearing the same sweater as the night before, eyes red, holding the phone charger he'd been searching for half an hour, unable to focus on anything ordinary. "She hasn't stopped," he said quietly to Lisa, almost afraid of his own voice. Lisa nodded. She couldn't stop watching Emily's mouth move, the way her lips formed each word as if rediscovering them from memory. The air felt warm and charged, heavy with the smell of toast and melting snow from boots by the back door. Mark walked in behind them carrying Luke, still half asleep, who blinked at the brightness and rubbed his eyes. He looked at Emily for a long second, expression unreadable, then asked, "Can she talk now?" The words sounded too plain for the moment, yet nobody knew what else to say. Rachel turned to him, her voice breaking. "She said your name again this morning, Luke. She said it as soon as she woke up." The boy just nodded, reaching for the chair across from her. He sat quietly, hands folded, while Emily stared at him with the same unblinking focus she had the night before. He smiled once, almost apologetically, as if unsure what she expected of him. Tim poured coffee for everyone, though no one touched it. He muttered something about driving to the clinic. Mark checked his watch, out of habit, and noticed his pulse had slowed. He felt oddly calm. The snow outside had turned to slush, sliding down the window panes in thin streaks that caught the light. The world looked muted, washed clean. Rachel's phone rang at last. She stepped aside to answer, pacing near the counter. "Yes, she's vocalizing. No, it's not just sounds. She's naming objects," she said, pressing her hand against her forehead. Her voice grew steadier as she explained, like someone trying to fit wonder into protocol. By mid-morning they were in the car, Rachel and Tim up front, Emily buckled in the back seat with Lisa beside her. Mark followed in their SUV, Luke strapped in silently. The drive to the therapy center took 40 minutes through thawing fields and roadside puddles, reflecting a dull sky. Inside the car, Emily hummed softly to herself, the tune uneven but intentional. Lisa's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide behind her scarf. "You're doing beautifully," she whispered, though she didn't know if the girl heard her. Luke watched through the window, tracing lines on the fogged glass with his fingertip. When they reached the clinic, fluorescent lights hummed above a row of chairs where other parents waited, coats piled on their laps. The speech therapist, a woman in her 40s with clipped hair and gentle authority, led Emily into a small observation room. Rachel followed, holding a notebook. Through the glass panel, the others watched as Emily pointed to pictures on a laminated chart and spoke 3 clear words: bird, water, sun. The therapist froze mid-note, then called for another specialist. They ran a standard evaluation, tested reflexes, checked hearing. Everything was normal. Every explanation failed. After an hour, Rachel stepped out, crying quietly but smiling through it. "They said it's spontaneous activation, emotional release," she told Lisa, laughing at the technical phrasing. "They have no other words for it." Luke leaned against the wall, looking down at his shoes. When the therapist thanked him for helping her friend, he shook his head. "She wanted to talk," he said again, voice calm, and that was all. But what happened that evening would turn relief into something else entirely. When they returned home, neighbors had already heard. Rachel's sister had shared the video privately, meaning to show only her prayer group, but within hours the clip circulated through local social media, thousands of views, comments ranging from disbelief to scripture quotes. Someone recognized the Reynolds from a church picnic years earlier. By the time dinner was on the table, Rachel's phone buzzed every few minutes with messages she couldn't bear to open. Inside the Collinses' kitchen, conversation fell apart under the noise of notifications. Mark scrolled through his own phone and found Luke's name on a local Facebook thread titled "The Christmas Boy." The phrase made his stomach tighten. Lisa tried to make it sound like harmless curiosity, saying people just needed something to believe in, but her voice lacked conviction. Rachel sat at the table, staring at her daughter who now spoke in short, careful sentences, simple words, but clear and deliberate. "More juice, please. Look, snow. Thank you." The sound filled the house like light after a storm. Tim went out to smoke despite the cold. Through the window, his figure looked small, the orange tip of his cigarette glowing like a signal in the dark. Mark joined him after a while. They didn't talk much, just stood side by side watching the yard. "It's too much," Tim said finally. "People are going to twist this." Mark nodded. "They already are." The snow began again, light and slow, turning the street into a haze of white. Inside, Luke sat cross-legged on the living room floor while Emily handed him crayons. "You draw," she said. He obeyed without a word, sketching something that looked like the outline of a bird rising from water. Rachel leaned on the doorway, whispering to Lisa. She hasn't drawn since therapy started. Lisa touched her arm, eyes wet. Maybe she just needed someone to listen. But as the evening deepened, an uneasy quiet settled. The air felt thicker, charged again like before lightning. Mark came back inside, brushed snow from his shoulders, and looked toward the children. Emily had stopped drawing. She was looking at Luke again, whispering something too soft to catch. Luke smiled, almost sadly. "Not now," he said under his breath. The adults heard only fragments, unsure if it was play. Hours later, when everyone finally slept, the wind shifted. Snow tapped against the windows in slow, steady rhythm. Luke lay awake on the pull-out couch, watching faint reflections of streetlights tremble on the ceiling. In the other room, Lisa whispered a prayer she hadn't said in years, asking not for proof, but for understanding. Mark lay beside her, pretending to sleep, staring at the outline of the curtain as if answers might appear in the folds of fabric. Down the hall, Rachel woke suddenly to the sound of laughter, soft, high-pitched, unfamiliar in her own home. She walked to Emily's door and saw the girl sitting upright, hands folded, whispering quietly as though speaking to someone invisible. "He said I can talk now," she murmured, half smiling, half crying, eyes open but distant. Rachel stepped closer, heart pounding. "Who said that, honey?" she asked. Emily turned toward her mother, her face calm. "Luke," she answered, and laid back down without another word. And though Rachel stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the furnace and the ticking of the vent, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere inside the silence, something greater than coincidence had begun to move. Morning stretched slow and pale over the neighborhood, thin light creeping across frost-rimmed rooftops and steaming from the Collins gutters as the temperature began to rise. Mark loaded their bags into the SUV while Lisa stood on the porch watching the children through the front window. Inside, Emily sat cross-legged on the living room rug with colored pencils scattered around her, drawing what looked like a house under a shining star. Luke sat beside her, helping her name each color. The furnace clicked on, blowing air that smelled faintly of dust and soap. For the first time in years, the Collins' home sounded like a home with a child's voice in it, soft, hesitant, but real. But by that afternoon, the noise outside their walls would grow louder than anyone expected. Tim kept opening and closing the same kitchen drawer, pretending to look for something, unable to sit still. Rachel moved between the sink and the window, half listening to Emily speak and half frightened by how natural it already seemed. "I want to record it," she said quietly. "Just in case." She set her phone on the counter, pressed the red button, and asked Emily simple questions. "What's this? Who's that?" Emily answered each with careful precision, her small voice clear enough to startle them both. When she said Luke, she smiled as though the word itself carried warmth. Luke only looked at her, calm, unstartled, then turned back to his drawing. Rachel posted a short clip to her church group, a circle of mothers who traded recipes and prayer intentions. Within hours, the clip multiplied across other pages, local friends, cousins, strangers leaving comments full of hearts and prayers. The algorithm carried it further than any of them imagined. By mid-afternoon, people were sharing it with captions like, "The Christmas Child in Rockford." Tim's phone buzzed so constantly he set it in a drawer just to hear himself think. Lisa noticed the tension building and whispered to Mark, "We should go before this gets weird." He nodded, but when he looked at Luke kneeling on the carpet beside the little girl who had found her voice overnight, he felt something like awe slip quietly into his doubt. That evening, the front yard filled with the orange light of sunset reflecting off melting snow. The two families ate in silence until Rachel's sister arrived, out of breath, holding her phone out for everyone to see. "You're on the news app," she said. "They're calling it a miracle." Tim swore under his breath. Mark muttered, "That didn't take long." Luke seemed untouched by it, eating slowly, asking Emily if she wanted more juice. She answered yes, her tone ordinary now, as if she had always spoken. But what happened after dinner would shake even Mark's practical calm. While Tim went outside to smoke and Rachel spoke with a local reporter who had already found their number, Lisa offered to help clean up. She carried dishes to the sink, the smell of dish soap and lemon cutting through the heavy air. When she turned to ask for a towel, she noticed Luke standing by the back door, staring out into the snow-lit dark. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked. He nodded but didn't move. "It's so quiet," he said, voice almost a whisper. "Too quiet." The words made her pause. "It's just the snow," she said gently, though she felt her chest tighten. Outside the yard, light flickered, not once, but 3 times, the exact rhythm of a heartbeat. Tim came in, stamping his boots. "We've got cars driving by real slow," he said. "People trying to see the miracle girl." Rachel told him not to exaggerate, but when they looked out the window, there were indeed 2 vehicles idling at the corner, exhaust rising in silver clouds. One driver rolled down his window and took a picture. Rachel shut the curtain hard. "This isn't good," she said. "I don't want her being some story." Tim rubbed his face, muttering about calling the police. Mark offered to speak to the people if they came to the door, but no one did. The cars left after a few minutes, leaving only tire tracks curving through the snow. Later, when the house finally quieted, Lisa tucked Luke into the guest bed. "Do you understand what happened with Emily?" she asked softly. "A little," he said. She wanted to talk, but she was afraid the words would get lost. Lisa hesitated. "How did you know that?" He looked at her, serious. "I just heard it." The simplicity of his answer unsettled her. She brushed his hair back, kissed his forehead, whispered, "Sleep now." But somewhere deep in the night, new voices began to stir around them. Rachel woke to the phone ringing again, another number she didn't recognize. She let it ring out, then opened the blinds. The snow had stopped. Moonlight lay over the street like a thin sheet of glass. She saw movement by the mailbox, a figure placing something there and walking away. She went out barefoot in her robe, breath fogging the air, and found a small envelope sealed with a cross drawn in pencil. Inside was a folded note that said only, "Ask the boy what he saw." Her hands shook as she read it, unsure whether to wake Tim or not. When she looked toward the house again, she thought she saw Luke at the upstairs window watching her, but the curtains fell before she could be sure. Morning brought more noise. Reporters had tracked the address. By 10 a.m., 2 vans were parked near the sidewalk, and a man with a camera stood shivering by the fence. Tim lost his patience first. "This is ridiculous," he said, storming outside to ask them to leave. Mark followed, trying to calm him. Inside, Rachel made Emily breakfast while Lisa scrolled through her phone, seeing headlines she didn't want to believe. "Child heals friend with words. The Christmas boy." She glanced at Luke, who was tracing a spoon across the table surface as if drawing invisible lines. "We need to go home," she said. "Today." Mark agreed. They packed quickly, Rachel hugging them with tears she couldn't explain, whispering, "Please tell him thank you, just once more." Luke smiled faintly and said, "You already did." But the drive back was not the end of it. Halfway to Pekin, their phones lit up again. A local radio station was discussing the video. Callers claimed to have seen a light in the sky that same night. Lisa turned the volume down, gripping her knees. "This is out of control," she said. Mark stared at the road ahead, headlights reflecting off wet asphalt, his face drawn. "People see what they want," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Luke sat between them, quiet, eyes following the rhythm of the wipers as though listening to something deeper than the sound of rain. When they reached home, the sky had turned a bruised blue, heavy with more snow. The hardware store sign flickered faintly across the street. Inside, the house felt smaller than before, each room filled with the faint hum of appliances and the scent of home that now seemed unfamiliar. Lisa set her purse down and turned to her son. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said, though he hadn't spoken. "I know," Luke replied. "It's just louder now." She didn't understand what he meant and didn't ask. That night Mark lay awake listening to the faint whistle of wind through the siding. Lisa slept restlessly beside him. Around 2 a.m., he heard footsteps in the hall. He rose quietly and found Luke standing at the front window, looking out at the streetlight that flickered the same way the Collinses' porch light had. "Can't sleep?" Mark asked. Luke shook his head. "They're scared," he said. "Who?" Luke didn't turn from the glass. "The people. They want to see something they can't hold." Mark stood beside him, the cold from the window seeping through his shirt. He opened his mouth to speak, but the light outside steadied, bright and unwavering, bathing both of them in pale gold for several silent seconds before dimming again. Luke turned, eyes calm. "It's okay now," he said, and walked back to bed. Mark stayed there a long time, watching the snow fall again, each flake drifting slow, deliberate, like a thought finding its place in the dark. The furnace clicked once more, the house breathing around him. In another part of town, unseen, a radio anchor was telling the story of a boy born on Christmas Eve who made a child speak for the first time, his voice softening as he said the words miracle and mystery in the same breath. Mark didn't hear it, but somehow he felt it, the weight of something larger than logic pressing gently against the edges of his understanding. And as the wind outside carried the faintest hum through the branches, it sounded almost like a voice, a single word stretched across the quiet before it faded back into the sound of falling snow. By early spring, the snow had receded into the ditches and along the shadowed side of fences, leaving behind a dull, wet shimmer that smelled faintly of soil waking up. The Reynolds' house stood quiet at the end of its street, gutters clinking in the thaw, the air filled with the slow rhythm of melting and dripping that marked the Midwest between seasons. Luke had grown taller over those months, his voice still soft but steady, his presence in the home a kind of calm gravity. Lisa returned to part-time work at the school, though she found herself glancing out of windows more often than before, thinking of how one ordinary night could divide life into before and after. Mark reopened the hardware store with new hours, pretending not to notice the people who lingered near the counter, curious to see the father of the Christmas boy. But even after the attention faded and the headlines turned to other stories, something in that house felt changed, lighter, as if the air itself had learned how to listen. When visitors came by to borrow tools or drop off casseroles, they often paused mid-sentence, commenting on how peaceful the place felt. Lisa would smile and offer coffee, unwilling to say aloud that peace was not something they had built, it was something they were given and were still learning how to hold. The spring storms came late that year. The first one rolled in one April evening, heavy with thunder that shook the glass and made the lights flicker. Lisa lit candles along the hallway, while Mark carried the flashlight box down from the shelf. Rain drummed on the roof, and through the half-dark they could hear sirens far off toward the highway. Luke sat on the living room floor, tracing his fingers along the carpet fibers, murmuring something that sounded like counting. The television cut to black, then silence filled the house. No hum, no fan, just the pulse of rain and thunder beyond the walls. But what happened in that stillness would become a memory neither of them could fully explain. For a few minutes, the entire block was dark, the storm's roar swallowing every smaller sound. Then, without warning, the windows brightened as if someone outside had struck a match the size of the sky. The room glowed gold-white, and Lisa saw Mark's face illuminated in mid-breath, eyes wide, frozen between fear and awe. Luke rose to his feet, walked to the window and whispered, "It's okay." The power returned a heartbeat later. The digital clock blinked 12. The furnace clicked back to life and the smell of warm dust returned to the air. Everything looked ordinary again, except for the row of seedlings Luke had planted in coffee cans along the windowsill. During the outage, they had sprouted tiny green leaves, impossible in that span of time, but alive and reaching toward the glass. The next morning sunlight poured across the yard, thin but gentle, carrying the scent of wet grass and earth. Mark went outside with his coffee and found that the storm had left their property untouched, while branches and debris lay scattered on every other lawn. He crouched, tracing his fingers through the damp soil, half expecting to find scorch marks where the light had been brightest. There was nothing. Only the quiet sound of robins returning to the trees and the faint hum of the world beginning again. Lisa came out to join him, her hair uncombed, wearing his old sweatshirt. "Maybe it skipped us," she said. "Maybe," he answered, but his voice carried no certainty, only wonder. A week later, Rachel and Emily arrived unannounced, their car tires leaving muddy lines along the curb. Emily ran up the steps first, speaking quickly now, words tumbling over each other with the eager rhythm of a child who has waited too long to use them. Lisa opened the door, and before she could say hello, Emily wrapped her arms around Luke, who had been sitting by the window reading. "I can sing now," she said breathlessly. He smiled, a small, quiet smile, as if he had already known. Rachel followed, carrying a framed photograph, the one taken that night months earlier when snow fell in perfect stillness. She handed it to Lisa, explaining she had it printed after noticing something strange. In the faint reflection between the two children was a third shape, soft and luminous, like a hand resting lightly on both their shoulders. "It's just the porch light," Rachel said quickly, almost to herself, but her voice trembled when she added, "I still needed to bring it to you." They spent the afternoon together, drinking tea while the children played in the yard. The air smelled of lilacs from the neighbor's fence, and a gentle wind carried bits of laughter toward the open kitchen door. Mark grilled sandwiches. Rachel told stories about how Emily's teachers couldn't stop smiling when they heard her read aloud for the first time. No one mentioned miracles anymore. It was enough to share the warmth of normal hours, to feel that strange hush of gratitude that doesn't need words. As evening came, the light turned golden again, spilling through the kitchen window onto the table where the photograph rested. Mark picked it up one last time, his thumb brushing the glass. "Do you think that's just reflection?" he asked softly. Lisa looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe it's how light keeps reminding us we're not alone." He nodded, set the frame down, and let the thought linger without chasing it. That Christmas Eve, almost a year after the night in Rockford, Luke woke his parents just before midnight. He stood by their bed holding a small candle, the wax already soft from his grip. "I want to light it," he said quietly, for anyone who still can't find their words. Mark followed him to the living room, Lisa beside them, all of them barefoot on the cold floor. The house was silent, the world outside frozen and waiting. Luke placed the candle on the windowsill between the sprouted plants, now grown tall and green. When he lit it, the flame rose steady and golden, barely flickering despite the draft that moved the curtains. None of them spoke. They simply watched, feeling the stillness settle like a blessing they hadn't asked for but were grateful to receive. Faith, they realized, was less about answers than about the small courage to keep waiting when the world falls silent, to trust that even in quiet houses and ordinary lives, grace can arrive like breath after a long-held pause. It doesn't demand belief or attention, it only asks to be noticed when it passes by. Somewhere beyond their window, church bells began to ring midnight mass, their sound carrying through the cold air, soft and distant, like memory calling home. Let us pray for those who still seek light in their darkest moments, for those who wait in silence, not knowing that hope already walks beside them. Let us remember the families who live with unanswered questions, the children who long to be heard, and the weary hearts who fear their faith has gone quiet. May peace find them in the places they least expect, in laughter returning after years of absence, in the hand of a friend, in the warmth of a single flame burning steady against the wind. May we never rush past the small mercies that renew us, nor forget the quiet strength that holds us together when words fail. For all who carry burdens unseen, may tonight bring rest, light, and the gentle assurance that they are not forgotten. Amen. If this story touched something in your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear that miracles still happen in small human ways. Tell us in the comments where faith found you again, or how grace has whispered in your own life. Like this video if you believe hope still travels from one soul to another, quietly, without fanfare. And if you wish, share it so that someone searching in silence might feel less alone. Thank you for watching. God bless you. Sometimes the smallest light, the one lit only for others, becomes the one that guides us home.